If we're to grasp the crucial role of difference for West German identity and society, it seems important to go back to the foundational moments of the Federal Republic. So in the aftermath of World War II, the Allies and the international community more generally pressed Germany to make a clean break from the Nazi regime by disavowing state-sponsored racism and publicly embracing democratization. Part of this process involved re-education and denazification policies introduced during occupation. So re-education aimed at weaning Germans from undue respect for authority, while denazification sought to eliminate Nazis from public life and civil service. Both of these programs had significant limitations, but they did push post-war Germans to reformulate the social and ideological parameters of their national identity. In particular, these policies underscored the fact that the Third Reich's national ideal of an Aryan Volksgemeinschaft had been powerfully discredited by the Nazi defeat. Privileging of an Aryan master race, efforts to destroy the Jews, and the belief in biologically based essential differences between groups of people were now firmly attached to the tarnished notion of Rasse. The concept itself had to be officially repudiated in order to transform West Germany into a democratic nation. But beyond these formalized programs, the US occupation greatly influenced how West Germans thought about the relationship between nation and difference. For one thing, the multi-ethnic composition of the occupation armies meant that former racial subordinates, like Jews and Slavs and North Africans and African Americans, now held positions of authority over Germans as members of the Allied forces. At the same time, the US Army's practice of racial segregation and anti-black racism taught West Germans that democratic forms and values could actually be, as Heidi Fehrenbach has argued, and then I'm quoting, consistent with racialist, even racist ideology and social organization. So in this way, military occupation reinforced ideas of white supremacy across American and German cultures, right? Thereby encouraging West Germans to reframe their conceptions of difference through a black-white lens. So as they rejected the idea of Rasse and its associations, West Germans in particular, gradually absorbed alternative modes of racial distinction. The upshot was that West German society developed a complex and even erratic posture toward race and difference. On the one hand, the category of Rasse was irrevocably tainted by the Nazi legacy, and then on the other hand, public leaders didn't really espouse a uniform or consistent policy against more immediate forms of racism in the present. So different expressions of racism were treated differently. It was impossible to invoke Rasse in relation to Jewish Holocaust survivors who remained in Germany, and in fact they were often shunted into a category of foreigners. But it was still possible to accommodate the racialist binary of black-white in thinking about the problem of Afro-German children, right? So occupation children. So these two kind of racial taxonomies were always understood as separate and distinct, rather than as a related set of ideas about difference. And while West Germans roundly condemned one taxonomy as racist or racialist, they unselfconsciously relied on the other to develop social policy. Now, the emergence of the Cold War mandate, of course, pushed the project of democratization away from denazification. As divisions hardened between the Allies, the US and British prioritized economic revival and integrating Germany into the Western Security Alliance. What that meant was that the primary tasks of democratization shifted away from purging the remnants of Nazi influence, and now we're focused on building a strong capitalist economy, shoring up democratic political institutions, and forging relations with the Western powers. Right, so for most West Germans, both government ministers and ordinary citizens, economic prosperity became the measure of successful democratization, that and anti-communism. But in terms of economic prosperity, the economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, of course, was also the crucial catalyst for bringing millions of visible foreigners back onto German soil. Right? The boom that began in the 1950s created an urgent demand for manpower, which the native population was ill-equipped to meet. So facing a massive labor shortage, authorities inaugurated a guest worker program, signing a recruitment treaty first with Italy in 1955, and then further agreements with Spain and Portugal, Turkey, Greece, and Yugoslavia in the 1960s. By the fall of 1964, the number of foreign workers in West Germany surpassed 1 million, and 5 years later the figure had nearly doubled. Right? So it's a lot of people that are coming over the course of this period. Now, the basic parameters of the guest worker program offered, I think, a second framework for shaping the way West Germans perceived the question of difference in their society. The program's central premise was that migrants would come to the Federal Republic to work on a temporary, short-term basis, right? And political authorities and industrial leaders agreed on a system in which recruited laborers would rotate in and out of the German labor force depending on production demands. So the labor treaties stipulated 2-year work and residence permits in order to reinforce this idea of rotation and return to the country of origin. The citizenship law in Germany, of course, reserved citizen status for those with German ancestry, right, based on the principle of jus sanguinis. So by this definition, guest workers were always foreigners. The post-war labor recruitment program presumed that the Federal Republic at its core was not an immigration country. And guest workers were not recruited to become permanent additions to German society, but to provide labor for a limited period and leave. And so that's in pretty significant contrast to other European cases like the British and the French. Political leaders, furthermore, clung to this view of temporary rotation long after shifting economic conditions undermined this initial logic and setup. So by the early 1960s, the employing firms realized that it was actually more expensive to recruit new workers every 2 years because of the capital investment, and so they wanted to, in fact, get more out of their workers, and so pushed the government to renew permits as often as possible. Right? And so as rotation became increasingly unprofitable, authorities then essentially ceased to enforce the rule of quick return, almost always granting extensions and effectively allowing Turks and other migrants to remain in Germany indefinitely. Guest workers, in turn, stretched their stays into years and even decades. Many sent for their spouses and children, especially after 1973, when the Federal Republic halted further recruitment. By the mid-1970s, moreover, Turks had surpassed all the other nationalities as the largest community of foreigners in West Germany. So despite what was taking place in practice, though, political leaders regularly intoned the same basic mantra: the Federal Republic is not a country of immigration. So this view of the labor migration shaped the way most West Germans thought about difference, making it difficult to apprehend guest workers as a significant or legitimate part of the social fabric. So everyday slights, such as serving fellow Germans first, or telling off-color jokes about Italians and Greeks, or refusing to rent an apartment to Yugoslavs seemed like excusable minor infractions against transient populations, right, rather than evidence of systematic discrimination. And even the decision to house guest workers in barracks on the outskirts of town, or city ordinances that restricted Turks from living in certain neighborhoods, or the disproportionate number of foreigners concentrated in the dirtiest and harshest and most unpleasant kinds of work, didn't really register as something called racism because guest workers were not understood to be a part of West German society, right? They weren't seen as members of society. The basic assumption here was that racism could only be present if prejudice and discrimination were directed against a portion of one's own population. And once ideas about race and difference were redefined around a black-white binary over the course of the 1950s, which is happening sort of simultaneous to this process, the possibilities for recognizing racialized or racist attitudes beyond the horizon of black-white decreased substantially. But perhaps the most immediate reason for the abiding blindness toward guest workers has something to do with the long shadow cast by Nazism. serious public discussion of the Nazi past began really in the late 1950s and gained momentum during the first half of the 1960s. These debates were intensified by young leftists who wanted to purge post-war society of what they saw as the lingering effects of Nazi fascism. So as 1968ers came of age, many of them became dissatisfied with the clipped descriptions of the Nazi era in their school books. They began to pose more pointed questions to their parents, and the most radical among them began to openly condemn the elder generation for their complicity with Nazism and for their conspicuous silence about the Nazi period. Now, these critiques that were leveled by young leftists were intimately bound up with the West German version of liberal democracy that had been built and embraced by their parents. Now, according to many 1968ers, this Auschwitz generation, is what they called them, had blindly pursued capitalist prosperity and embraced anti-communism at the expense of taking responsibility for Nazi crimes. The failure to deal with the past meant that fascism had not been fully rooted out of German society, and these students viewed the Federal Republic's supposedly democratic political institutions as totally corrupt, creating the conditions for an imminent reconstitution of fascism. This is the rhetoric that they often used in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So this sense of continuity was bolstered by their theoretical understanding of Nazism, which they interpreted as a product of the highest stage of capitalism, right? So there's a kind of link for many of the 68ers between capitalism and fascism. The new left's preoccupation with capitalism and fascism had a number of unintended consequences, though. For one thing, it led critics to subsume the singularity of the Nazi genocide under a generic category of fascism, right? So to obscure the distinctiveness of National Socialism as it developed in Germany, to downplay the anti-Semitic aspects of Nazism and ignoring its Jewish victims. But the fixation on capitalism and fascism also obscured the growing importance of new forms of race indifference that were emerging in West German society. To be sure, a handful of leftist artists and intellectuals did extend their criticism to the guest worker program, but mostly to point out that the exploitation of foreign workers was the most extreme example of West Germany's indifference to the human costs of unbridled capitalism. By framing their social critique through capitalism and fascism, new leftists were highly conscious of the structural continuities between the Nazi regime and the Federal Republic, but surprisingly oblivious to the ways that social actors and conditions had changed in the post-war period. Now, in important ways, these three historical frameworks laid the groundwork for an ideological common sense about the place of racial and ethnic difference in the Federal Republic. Embracing democracy did not mean that racial distinctions disappeared, but rather that they were reformulated in terms of a black-white binary that seemed to have limited relevance for German society. Guest workers were understood as foreigners and thus unimaginable as members of the national body. And especially with the maturation of the 1968ers, vigilance against any expression of Nazi fascism represented the central task of Germany's engagement with difference in the post-war period.